Ray Manzarek waited 3 hours outside Jim Morrison's door. What Jim finally said changed the band forever. Cinematic story begins. There are moments in a life that arrive without announcement. No drum roll, no warning light above the door. Just a hallway, a closed door, and a silence so complete that a man begins to question everything he thought he knew about the person on the other side. Ray Manzarek had known Jim Morrison for years by then. He had sat beside him in studios while Jim stared at the ceiling before delivering a vocal take that made engineers cry. He had watched Jim transform in front of 50,000 people. Not perform, but transform, as though the stage were a threshold between this world and something older. But he had never stood outside a closed door for 3 hours, wondering whether Jim was alive. And the thing that would change everything, for the band, for the music, for the years that followed, was not the silence. It was what Jim said when the door finally opened. That single sentence would echo through every record they made afterward. It would change how Ray played, how Jim sang. And decades later, when Ray described that moment in interviews, his voice would drop to barely a whisper, as if the words still carried the full weight of that night. But to understand what Jim said, you have to understand what had brought them both to that hallway in the first place. By 1968, Jim Morrison was no longer simply a person. He had become a symbol. And symbols, he was learning, do not get to rest. The Doors had arrived in the American consciousness like a slow-burning fire. Not the loudest band, not the most technically complex, but carrying something others didn't. A darkness, a weight, a feeling that the songs were not being performed so much as confessed. When Jim sang, people recognized something in themselves they had not been able to name. That kind of resonance is a gift. It is also a cage. Jim had grown up understanding distance. Born in Melbourne, Florida in 1943, he was the son of a Navy admiral, a man of structure, of a world in which emotions were subordinate to duty. He rejected that world early and completely, but not without cost. There was something in him, some fundamental ache that distance had carved out and left hollow. He spent years filling that space with poetry, philosophy, a restless hunger. He had found Ray at UCLA, two young men on a beach in Venice, California, one talking about music, the other about poetry. The Doors formed not as a band exactly, but as a conversation, an attempt to find out what happened when poetry and music stopped being separate things. But somewhere between the first album and the third, the conversation had begun to fracture. The fame had arrived faster than anyone expected. The audience had decided what Jim Morrison was supposed to be, and Jim had begun to feel the weight of their decision pressing on his chest each time he stepped onto a stage. He had started drinking more heavily. The sharp intelligence was still there, in the notebooks he filled compulsively, in poems arriving at all hours. But there were long stretches when Jim disappeared into himself. Ray had watched this with the anguish of someone who loves a person and cannot reach them. And then came the night that brought everything to a point. It had been a difficult stretch. Recording sessions for one of their most ambitious records, the studio charged with unspoken friction. Jim would arrive with a notebook full of vivid ideas, then 2 hours later be somewhere else entirely. Not physically gone, but unreachable. On the night in question, Jim had not shown up to the session at all. Something about this particular absence felt different to Ray. Not moodiness, something final feeling, like a man getting very quiet before saying something he has been keeping to himself for a long time. Ray found out where Jim was staying. He drove across the city as the Los Angeles skyline dissolved into amber haze behind him. The building was unremarkable, the kind of place chosen by someone who wants to be invisible. Ray found the room number and knocked. No answer. He knocked again. He called Jim's name through the door, low enough not to disturb the other rooms, urgent enough that Jim, if he was conscious, would hear. Still nothing. Ray sat down on the floor outside the door. He would wait. What passes through a person's mind during 3 hours of silence outside a closed door? Ray would describe it later as a kind of forced reckoning. He thought about the band, the years spent building something together, not just a career but a genuine artistic project, a shared language that still felt, in its best moments, like nothing else in the world. And he thought about Jim, not the icon, not the dark poet of the counterculture. He thought about Jim, the person, the one who quoted Blake in casual conversation, who laughed at unexpected things. The Jim who had once told Ray that the thing he feared most was not failure, but disappearance. The feeling of ceasing to be seen for what he actually was beneath all the mythology. That fear, Ray now understood, had been coming true for some time. The hallway was narrow and poorly lit, the kind of institutional space that exists only as a passage between places. A vending machine hummed around the corner. The sounds of the city came through in muffled waves, traffic, voices, the distant bass of a radio somewhere. Ordinary sounds of a world continuing without awareness of what might be happening behind a specific closed door. Ray sat with his back against the wall and did not leave. An hour passed, then two. Other guests moved through with the slightly averted eyes of people who do not want to know about other people's crises. He had brought nothing, no book, no notebook, just himself and the door and whatever was behind it. Around the third hour, something changed. He stood up. He knocked again, gently. The door opened. Jim Morrison looked like a man who had been underwater. Not in distress exactly, but with that quality of someone who has been somewhere else entirely and only recently returned. His hair was disheveled, the same clothes as 2 days ago. His eyes were clear but distant, as if still adjusting to the light. He looked at Ray for a long moment without speaking. Ray looked back at him. The whole of the hallway held its breath. And then Jim Morrison opened his mouth and said the thing that would change everything. He said, "I don't know how to be this and still be me." That was it. 7 words. No preamble, no context, no explanation. Just 7 words delivered in the quiet, precise voice Jim used when he was saying something he had been carrying for a long time and had finally found the shape for. Ray stood in the doorway and felt the words arrive like something physical, not a blow, but a weight across his shoulders and chest. Not because the words were surprising, because they weren't. Because Ray had been watching the thing those words described for months without the language for it. Now he had the language. It was heavier than he had expected. Because Ray understood immediately what Jim meant. The fame, the mythology, the expectation, the audience's need for Jim Morrison to perpetually be the thing they had decided he was. This was not sustainable alongside the actual Jim. The poet, the man who had existed before the name became a symbol. Jim was not having a breakdown. He was having a reckoning. And he had needed someone to come and stand outside his door for 3 hours before he could say it. Ray stepped inside the room. Jim sat down on the bed, not in the posture of crisis, but in the posture of someone who has finally set something heavy down. The room was dim, lit by a single lamp. On the desk were notebooks, open, Jim's handwriting covering the pages in the dense, urgent cursive Ray recognized from years of watching him write. Ray sat in the chair across from the bed and did not speak immediately. Jim looked at the floor. Then he looked at Ray. The songs we're making, they're real. I can feel it when we're in the room together and something is happening and we're past the point where it's craft anymore. I know that's real. Ray nodded. But the thing around it, Jim continued, the thing that people need it to be, I'm not that. I never was that. I keep trying to figure out how to give them the music without giving them me, without having them take what I am and make it into something I can't live inside. He paused. Outside, the city moved on without them. And I can't figure it out. I've been in this room for 2 days and I can't. Ray was quiet for a moment. Then he said, maybe you're not supposed to figure it out. Maybe the music is already doing the thing you're trying to do. Maybe the songs are carrying the truth, even when everything around them is lying. Jim looked at him for a long time. "You think that's enough?" he said. "I think that's everything," Ray said. The room was still. Jim exhaled slowly, not dramatically, just the ordinary sound of a body releasing what it has been holding. "Okay," he said, "then let's go back and finish the record." They returned to the studio the next morning. The people there noticed something different immediately. Not dramatic, but quiet. A quality of presence that Jim carried into the room that had not been there before. A stillness at the center of him. Not the stillness of withdrawal, but of someone who has decided to be fully present. He was still Jim Morrison, still restless, still intense. But there was something less defended about him, as though he had given himself permission to bring the actual person into the room rather than the performance of the person. The sessions that followed were different. Not easier, creative work is never easy, but the music carried something, a quality of nakedness, of genuine exposure, the feeling that the songs had been arrived at rather than constructed. The band responded. Robbie Krieger noticed that Jim was listening differently, more willing to be changed by what the other instruments were doing. John Densmore felt a new spaciousness in the performances, a quality of breath that made the music feel less like a composition and more like a conversation. The audience felt it too. They heard something past craft, past performance. They heard a person. What Ray had understood that night was that Jim Morrison's art and his life were not separate territories. They were the same ground. Jim could not offer the music without offering himself, and offering himself night after night to audiences who needed a symbol rather than a person. This was a cost that accumulated invisibly. The music would survive. It already belonged not to the band, but to the people who heard it and found in it the shape of their own unexpressed experience. But the man, with his notebooks and his fear of disappearance, needed something the music could not provide. He needed to be seen, just as himself. Ray had tried to arrange it the only way available to him, by sitting on a hallway floor for 3 hours and refusing to leave. The Doors continued. They made records that would outlast every expectation anyone had ever had of them. Jim continued to write. The notebooks kept filling, poems arriving at all hours. He was still searching, still trying to resolve the equation of how to carry a life and a myth in the same body. Perhaps the attempt itself was the generative thing, the friction that produced the heat. Jim Morrison died in Paris in July of 1971. He was 27 years old. No audience, no cameras, no performance, only the city and the morning and the absence of the person who had been there the night before. Ray received the news in Los Angeles. He would later describe the moment as one in which time briefly stopped functioning in its normal way, as if the world had paused to register what had happened before deciding whether to continue. He thought about the hallway, about the 3 hours on the floor, and the door opening, and the 7 words, about Jim walking into the studio the next morning, setting down his jacket, opening his notebook, as if the previous 2 days had been a necessary interval in which something had been worked out that could not have been worked out any other way. He thought about what Jim had said in that dim room. "You think that's enough? I think that's everything." He had been right. The music proved it in the only way art can prove anything, by outlasting the moment that made it, by meaning something to people who had never been in that room, never walked that hallway, but who heard in the music the shape of something true. There is a question that gets asked about certain music, music that has outlasted its era, that continues to find new listeners and means something to them, not entirely explicable by history or craft. The question is, why does it stay? What Ray understood is that the music stays because it was made from something true. Not polished truth, the raw kind, the kind that costs something, the kind that comes from a person genuinely trying to say what they mean, even when the saying leaves them exposed in ways that have real consequences. Jim had never been good at protecting himself from his own honesty. This had complicated his life, his relationships, his ability to navigate the ordinary demands of a career. It had sometimes made him impossible, but it had also made the music. Every song that still finds someone at the right moment, every late-night listen on an empty highway, every quiet room where someone feels, inexplicably, less alone, is a consequence of that honesty, of a person who could not maintain distance between himself and what he was making, of 7 words said in a doorway to someone who had waited long enough. Ray Manzarek spent the rest of his life understanding this. He spoke about Jim with the careful, complicated love of someone who had known a person fully, not the myth, not the symbol, but the actual human being with all the difficulty and beauty that entails. He never reduced Jim to a legend, never allowed the story to become simple, because the story was always what it had been from the beginning, 2 people trying to make something real, knowing that the attempt itself is both the point and the cost. That was the doors. That was what Ray had found outside a closed door in a narrow hallway, 3 hours into a silence that had no guarantee of ending. That was what Jim had given him with 7 words. And that is why, decades later, when the city is quiet and the night is long, and someone puts the music on, the songs still arrive with the full weight of what they cost. Not as relics, not as nostalgia, as truth. The applause was real. So was the silence afterward, and between them, in that narrow space where art lives and legends are made from ordinary human need, Ray Manzarek stood outside a door and refused to leave. That refusal changed everything. The music remembers.